Yesterday, we were, the last thing we're doing was looking at the Council of Nicea. Who called together this council? Who called the bishops together at the Council of Nicea? Okay, if you don't remember these simple things, I'm not sure how you're going to remember more detailed things. Constantine, Emperor Constantine, called together the council, and over what issue? Or who's teaching?
Arianism?
Arianism, or Arius. And what did Arius teach? What did he believe? Amelia, what did Arius believe? Mia?
Didn't he believe that they were thinking about polytheism outside the Trinity?
Well, he was concerned about that, and so he developed his own theory, which was what? What did he say about Christ? Are you looking for your assignment, Griff? Yeah, we got it.
Okay.
What did Arius say about Christ, Stephen?
Time when he was not God.
Yeah, there was a time when he was created. There was a time when he did not exist. He was a created being, which makes him less than God. So Constantine called together this council of bishops, and they met together, and there were 3 different groups that formed within that body of bishops. Only bishops could speak at this council. So Arius was not allowed to talk, but his friend Eusebius was the spokesperson. And they developed a theory which they called heterousios. What does heterousios mean when it's talking about God? We're talking about the Father and the Son. Heterousios.
Different substance.
They're of different substance, right. So the Father and the Son are not the same. They have a different substance. On the other side, we have Alexander from Alexandria and Athanasius, the main spokesperson. Their theory was called homoousios, which means what?
Same
substance. So the Father and the Son are of the same substance. They're both God. Now, I told you yesterday that during the presentation that Arius wasn't allowed to speak, but he broke out into song. And here is what he sang. I wish I knew the tune. I would sing it for you, but I don't. And I don't want to make up a tune because it would just sound the same all the way through. But here are the words. The uncreated, and see, follow his ideas and why his songs communicated his erroneous idea. The uncreated God has made the Son. All right, so what's that saying? God is not created, but the Son is created. A beginning of things created. He's the beginning. In other words, of all the things created, he was created first. And by adoption has God made the Son into an advancement of himself. So the Son wasn't originally like God, but God caused him to become more like him by adopting him. Yet the Son's substance is removed from the substance of the Father. So it is heterousios. The Son is not equal to the Father, nor does he share the same substance. God is the all-wise Father, and the Son is the teacher of his mysteries. The members of the Holy Trinity share unequal glories. Did you follow what he's saying in this song? He starts singing this at the Council of Nicea. Well, remember I told you before there was a notable person there, maybe not so much at the time, but he's notable to us today. He's known as St. Nicholas of, oh, my mind's going blank. The name of the city starts with an M. Myra. When Nicholas heard Arius singing this heretical song, Nicholas got up, strode across the expanse between them, as you see here, and came up to Arius and slapped him in the face. here's a cartoon somebody drew. Homo, you see us, singing about. Okay, why was he invited? Arius is singing. I thought we were taking a break. Someone ought to break something. Homo, and then here's Santa Claus smacking Arius in the face. So, sort of changes your ideas about Saint Nick, doesn't it? But I say, go Saint Nick. Way to go. Because that was not the kind of behavior they wanted to encourage at the council, they kicked Saint Nick out. He wasn't allowed to be there anymore. But I say it was worth it. I don't know if he did or not. But so this person who became known for his kind-heartedness, for his giving, and we celebrate him with a sort of a perverted view called Santa Claus. But he was a man who stood up for truth, stood up for Jesus Christ as God. Okay, so let's go back to the meeting here. So we've got these two opposing viewpoints, and a third party emerged, and that was led by Eusebius of Caesarea. Now, do you remember him? Who was Eusebius of Caesarea? What was he known for doing? He was known as being a writer, a historian. He wrote a history of the church. He wrote a history of Constantine. Well, he's Constantine's friend. And he tries to take a mediating position. So he said, one side says the Father and the Son are of the same, a different substance. The other side says they're the same substance. How about if we just put an I in here? You see the difference between this word and this word? Just that I. So it's homoi, not homoousios, but homoiousios. And what that little I in there does, it changes from being the same to being similar. So Eusebius says, how about if we kind of have a middle ground here? We won't say that the Father and the Son are different. We won't say they're exactly the same, but can we agree that they're similar? Can both sides agree on that? And that's what he wanted to do. All right, so Eusebius puts forth this point of view, and the majority of the bishops slide to his side. They say, that sounds pretty good. Eusebius did have an agreement with Arius in that he felt that Christ had a beginning in time in eternity past. But he did not believe he was created out of nothing but came out of the Father. So Eusebius really is kind of in between the two positions. All right, so Eusebius is a friend of the emperor. Eusebius proposes a middle ground. Eusebius has the majority of the bishops on his side. But who makes the final decision? Constantine, the emperor, who may or may not have really been a Christian. He's making the final decision as to which one of these is right. Do you trust that? Well, which side do you think he went with? Which side do you think he went with?
Oh boy.
This one?
Alexander.
You think he went with Alexander?
Mm-hmm.
Why?
Because it's...
This is his friend. This has most of the bishops. You don't think he went with that?
But he believes that Christ was like the same substance.
So he had the right belief. Yeah, he did. He said these guys are the ones that are right. Now we have an interesting situation here. We have an emperor calling the church bishops together to settle an issue in the church. And we have the emperor who is making the final decision as to what the church ought to believe. None of that should really happen. But at the same time, God is sovereign, and he oversaw this to the extent that Constantine not only did the right thing and bring them together, but made the right decision as to which one is the one that the church should believe. Kind of amazing when you think about it. There were some other issues settled at the Council of Nicea. There was the separation of certain biblical holidays from the biblical lunar calendar. In other words, and primarily this is talking about the resurrection, when to celebrate the resurrection. Constantine believed that it should always be celebrated on the day of the sun. Since Jesus arose on the first day of the week, it should always be celebrated on that day of the week instead of whenever the moon happens to be full at that time of year. So that influenced Western Christianity in that direction, as we have talked about previously. All right. So here's the situation then. We have this Council of Nicea in 325, which is combating the issue of Arianism, addressing Arianism, and they come out with this perspective, that Christ was very God of very God. Very means you can't get any more God than he was. So he is totally God of total God. That Christ was of one substance with the Father. In other words, homoousios. They're both of the same substance. Thirdly, Christ was begotten, not made. Begotten indicates more his human origin, but he was not a created being. So he is considered to be the begotten Son of God. That was a place of position, not a place of origin. I want to say that again. Being begotten was a position, not a place of origin. So in other words, he didn't come into being by being begotten. He was begotten because that was his position as the Son of the Father. Didn't make him any less than the Father. It didn't mean he had a beginning from the Father. He always was, but his position in relationship to the Father was the begotten one, or the Son. All right, and that's what they were indicating. Fourthly, it said that Christ became human for us men and for our salvation. He became human, not that he was human already and God adopted him. He became human for our benefit, especially for our salvation. Because if he had not become human, if God had not become human, our salvation would never have been paid for. It never could have existed. Now, there is a creed that came out of this. It wasn't enacted in 325. This really kind of is an error. The Nicene Creed wasn't written in 325. It was written later to reflect what they had said in 325. But let's read this and see what you think about it. So let's do something different. Let's read it together. All right, can we read it out loud? Can we try that in unison? All right, ready? We believe in one God, the Father, all-governing, creator of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, begotten of the Father as only begotten, that is, from the essence of the Father, God from God, light from light, true God from true God, begotten, not created, of the same essence as the Father, through whom all things came into being, both in heaven and in earth, who for us men and for our salvation came down and was incarnate, becoming human. He suffered, and the third day he rose, and ascended into the heavens. And he will come to judge both the living and the dead. And believe in the Holy Spirit. So they kind of threw that last part in there. Because they realized, hey, we didn't mention anything about the Holy Spirit. We ought to at least say we believe in him. Not saying what, but we do believe in him. Okay, so you see the main parts here? You can see how careful they are being of explaining their position that Jesus Christ is fully God, that he doesn't have a beginning. He's the same substance with God, the Father. John?
Is like a version of this said in the church today?
The Apostolic Creed will build on this.
Okay.
And that comes a little bit later.
Uh-huh.
And that's the one that most people say. Although some might say the Nicene Creed too. There might be some churches that will recite that together. Now, unfortunately, that's not the end of Arianism. In fact, after the initial rejection in 325 at the Council of Nicea, it actually gains in popularity, which is kind of, you wonder how that could happen. And then through the work of three guys called the Cappadocians, they brought it back to the Council of Constantinople, and it was finally rejected for good then. Another way of looking at it is, here's the victory over Arianism, here's the decrease in truth as people are following it, and then the final victory over Arianism occurs in 381, the Council of Nicaea. So it was the labor of these three guys, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, and Gregory of Nazianzus. And two of these guys are brothers. I don't think it's the two Gregories. It's Basil and one of the Gregories. I'm not sure. I think it's these two maybe are brothers. And they did a lot of writing about this to convince people that Arianism was wrong. So in your notes you have the period of Arian resurgence, and there's some more information there that I haven't given you. Are there any blanks there that I did not give you that you need to fill in? Under the period of resurgence, Arian resurgence, or the period of final victory?
The new Eastern Emperor
Constantius.
openly embraced
Arianism. So the emperor after Constantine had said Arianism is wrong, here's the right thing, but then the one who followed him said, I like Arianism. Okay, any other blanks that need filled in?
And the last one is, today Arianism can be found in blank blank.
Okay, there is a cult today that is Arian. They believe that Jesus, that Jesus Christ was a created being. He was not God, and that is the Jehovah's Witnesses. All right, does that complete everything?
Mm-hmm.
I would suggest you read over the material there. I did not read it to you. You are able to read, so I didn't cover everything there, but read it over, you might find some other interesting information. All right, we are going to go out of our notes now for a few minutes and watch a Drive Through History episode which talks about some of these issues. So strap on your helmets.
The earliest history of Byzantium was as a Persian city, and then later a Greek outpost. But for our purposes, the real significance of the city emerges when the Romans took over in the year 171 AD. Then if we fast forward 150 years, we come to one of history's most prominent figures, Roman Emperor Constantine. Constantine began to recognize the strategic importance of the city of Byzantium and then began to pour in huge amounts of imperial capital from Rome into the city.
Under Constantine's ambitious leadership, the city of Byzantium was rebuilt and enlarged into the bona fide eastern capital of the Roman Empire. Unfortunately for Constantine, moving the empire's capital from Rome to Byzantium would soon lead to a permanent schism between the Western and Eastern Roman empires, with the western part slowly losing prominence. But it also opened a floodgate of influence traveling both directions. To this day, many artistic, architectural, and religious influences in Europe and the Western world can be traced back to Constantine's Byzantium.
He even renamed it after himself, calling it Constantinople, and for nearly 1,000 years, the center of gravity for the entire Western civilization was right here.
But his impact on world history is far greater than simply moving the seat of Roman power to the east. A closer look during the years leading up to his bold decision to move the capital to Byzantium reveals an unexpected transformation in his own life, a transformation that would eventually lead Emperor Constantine to play a decisive role in Christian history.
A fascinating change happened later in the life of Roman Emperor Constantine. He looked up in the sky and saw the sign of a cross, and the words, "In this sign conquer," just before a battle in which he was triumphant. Because of this, he not only legalized Christianity, but he converted to it, and took this often disregarded and persecuted sect of Christianity and gave it the ultimate designation of state religion of Rome.
The sign, allegedly seen in the sky that day by Constantine, was this. It's called the Labarum, and it consists of the first two Greek letters of the word Christ. He even ordered the emblem to be placed on every shield of his army before he proceeded on to victory. Constantine was forever changed, and as emperor of the Roman Empire, his newfound affinity for Christianity would lay a new foundation in the history of Western civilization. His legalization of Christianity came in the form of a declaration called the Edict of Milan, stating officially that the Roman Empire would end all state-sponsored persecution of Christianity. This effectively lifted the once beleaguered group of Christians to privileged status. The edict was jointly issued by Constantine in the west and the Eastern Emperor Licinius. But Licinius soon reneged on his promises, reinstituting Christian persecution in the east, and a civil war broke out, resulting in Licinius's death and the Roman Empire finally being united under Constantine's reign. The Edict of Milan, now almost 1,700 years old, is stunning in how it aspires to religious liberty at a time when such things were almost unheard of.
No one whatsoever should be denied the opportunity to give his heart to the observance of the Christian religion. Anyone of those who wishes to observe the Christian religion may do so freely and openly, without they have also conceded to other religions the right of open and free observance of their worship for the sake of the peace of our times.
This idea of religious freedom fit well with Christianity. Prominent church fathers and theologians already knew their faith forbade forced conversions of any kind. One famous quote was this: "In order to defend religion, man must be willing to die, but not to kill." It's also important to say that the Edict of Milan wasn't the primary reason the Christian movement survived and grew. Before the edict was issued, the movement had grown such that in the West, 1 in 5 were believers, and in a large section of the East, Christians made up half the population. But it did mean that countless Christians were released from prisons and slavery. Property that had been confiscated had to be returned to Christians. The church was free from taxation, and even the sanctity of Sunday, the Christian day of worship, was placed under state protection. Now, this sudden intrusion of the emperor and the state into church affairs was a messy business and often did more harm than good for the church. In fact, with the blending of Constantine's immense power with his new loyalty to Christianity, he soon found himself in the middle of a huge controversy that arose in the early 4th century. It was a controversy called Arianism. named after a priest named Arius from Alexandria, Egypt, who taught that Jesus had not always existed, but was a created being and that he was subordinate to God the Father. Now, most Christians today take the doctrine of the Trinity for granted, that all three persons of the Godhead, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, are all equal and have always existed. But this doctrine was only agreed upon after a lot of blood, sweat, and tears. In the year 325, Emperor Constantine finally realized that the Arian controversy wasn't going away, so he called the First Council of Nicea in the city of Nicea, less than 60 miles from Byzantium. The purpose of this worldwide conference of Christian bishops was to resolve bitter disagreements over the nature of Christ and the Trinity. Ironically, a doctrine this important hung on one tiny Greek letter, the iota. The Arian group believed Christ was of similar substance as the Father, homoousion, while the anti-Arian group, the group that ultimately prevailed, believed he was of the same substance as the Father, homoousion. After more than 2 months, the council finally issued a broad theological statement that affirmed unequivocally that Christ the Son shares the same divine substance as the Father. The Nicene Creed, over 1,600 years later, is the most widely accepted creed in the Christian Church.
I believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord, Jesus Christ, the only begotten Son of God, begotten of the Father before all worlds, God of God, light of light, very God of very God, begotten, not made, being of one substance with the Father, by whom all things were made.
The statement that is today known as the Nicene Creed has undergone some revisions, but it reflects, as it did back in 325, the Church's recognition of Christ's eternal and divine nature. And while the Arian controversy wasn't totally solved by the Nicene Council, it eventually dwindled and is still today considered a heresy. But sadly, even though the Church did unify around several such councils throughout Church history, it was becoming increasingly divided, finally resulting in an east-west split of its own in the year 1054. This schism, which still exists today, resulted in the Church being divided into Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. And although it happened for a wide variety of reasons, many argue it is due in large part to Constantine's decision to move the capital of the empire to Constantinople way back in the year 330. His influence on Christianity, while significant, was clearly a mixed bag.
Constantine was the first in a legacy of no fewer than 88 emperors, none of which were able to achieve the power, fame, and notoriety of Constantine himself. Behind me is the Great Wall that fortified the city of Constantinople. But as the city thrived in power and influence, the Roman Empire itself dwindled until there was not much left but this city and a few outlying regions.
The Western Roman Empire and the city of Rome itself had been invaded and sacked by barbarians less than 100 years after Constantine moved his power to Byzantium, resulting in Rome never again exerting the political supremacy it once held. But Constantinople, even with the Roman Empire dwindling all around it, remained prominent. But for centuries, it was a prime target for any military force that came rolling through this part of the world.
The final conquest of the city of Constantinople happened in 1453 with the invasion of the Ottoman Turks. Now, the city had been successful in holding back Muslim Turks for almost 2 centuries, but the final siege pitted 150,000 Muslims against a mere 10,000 defenders of this city. The city fell, and the character of Constantinople was changed from distinctively Christian to entirely Muslim.
Constantinople found itself under siege on April 2nd, 1453. In less than 2 months, it would all be over. Sultan Mehmed II, also known as Mohammed II, first moved his 70 cannons into position and began pounding away at the magnificent wall that surrounded the city. Mehmed had acquired state-of-the-art cannons, one of which was 27 feet long and fired a 1,200-pound ball. It would shock and awe, 1453 style. Meanwhile, the Turks dug tunnels under the huge walls in order to make them collapse more easily. But the defenders of Constantinople luckily had captured an enemy engineer and extracted a confession. This enabled them to locate and destroy the tunnels.
That pivotal point in the final siege of Constantinople happened right here, with a move of genius military strategy.
Here on the east side of the city, the water side, Constantinople was extremely vulnerable because of the entrance to the Golden Horn waterway that leads right into the heart of the city. The Christian defenders had had their hands full defending the walls on the west side, but they figured this side was safe from attack because they had constructed a practical and seemingly foolproof way to block the entrance.
The Ottoman commander, Mehmet, approached the city with his entire fleet of Turkish warships to destroy the city of Constantinople. Now, the defenders of the city had constructed a way to defend this waterway with a gigantic chain that stretched from this side to the other side. The idea was to prevent these warships from gaining access into the city of Constantinople.
Now, Mehmet could have taken the direct approach and tried to break the chain, but it was defended, and it would have cost him dearly. Instead, he devised the most ingenious and unexpected plan.
He constructed a roadway on land around the chain using greased logs.
This slipway of greased logs wasn't just for Mehmet's foot soldiers. Using animal and manpower, he dragged half his fleet of warships on land around the chain and its defenders, totally exploiting the city's greatest point of vulnerability. Meanwhile, the Muslim invaders continued pounding away at the walls of the city. On May 29th, the defenses collapsed.
Okay, that's a little ahead of where we are, but something about the city of Constantinople. No assignment for tonight. Make sure you're looking over your notes. Let's try to learn some of these things that we have gone over, not only for quizzes and tests, but for your own knowledge.